There is a version of Ron Howard that the world has always felt comfortable with. He is the freckle-faced boy from Mayberry, the steady hand behind some of Hollywood's most beloved films, the man who somehow turned decades of cutthroat competition into a career that everyone respects and almost no one resents. He is by most accounts the last genuinely decent man standing in an industry that has a long and well-documented tradition of chewing decent men alive. But here is the thing about nice people who survive in brutal places: they are never as soft as they appear. Beneath Ron Howard's calm demeanor and his easy, reassuring smile is a man who has been through the fire more times than his public image suggests. He was a child actor navigating the massive, complicated personalities of the golden age. He was a young director trying to prove himself to stars who had been famous longer than he had been alive. He was a collaborator, a peacemaker, a problem solver, and occasionally a man who simply had to hold his ground and refused to be moved. Over a career spanning 6 decades, Ron Howard encountered actors who tested him in ways that were sometimes terrifying, sometimes heartbreaking, and occasionally transformative. Some were cold, some were volcanic, some were intellectually domineering, some were self-destructive, and one, perhaps the most complicated of all, was simply his best friend. Each of these encounters left a mark. Each one taught him something that no film school in the world could have provided. This is the story of 6 actors who shaped Ron Howard by making his life genuinely difficult, and how, by surviving each of them, he became one of the greatest filmmakers Hollywood has ever produced. To understand what it meant for a young Ron Howard to work alongside Francis Bavier, you first have to understand what Francis Bavier meant to America. During the early 1960s, when the Andy Griffith Show was pulling in audiences week after week, Aunt Bee was more than a television character. She was a national idea, the embodiment of nurturing femininity, small-town patience, and unconditional domestic love. Children across the country looked at her and felt safe. And young Ronnie Howard, playing her screen nephew Opie, was supposed to feel the same way. He did not. The reality of Francis Bavier on set was something that Howard has reflected on with characteristic thoughtfulness in interviews and in his memoir, co-written with his brother Clint. What the cameras captured was warmth. What existed between takes was something far more complicated. Bavier was a classically trained stage actress from New York, a woman who had devoted her life to the craft of serious, demanding theatrical performance. She had studied, she had sacrificed, and she had worked with fierce dedication toward a vision of her own artistic identity that had very little to do with playing a cheerful aunt in a rural situation comedy. She felt, in a word, trapped. And the particular tragedy of Francis Bavier is that she was extraordinarily good at playing a character she privately considered beneath her. Every episode, she delivered warmth, and every episode, it cost her something. That cost had a way of showing up in her behavior between scenes, in the chill that settled over the set when she was present, in the rigid professionalism she maintained like a wall between herself and everyone else, in the quiet but unmistakable signal she sent to cast and crew alike that she was not here to make friends. For a young child actor, this was confusing in a way that went beyond ordinary social awkwardness. Children are extraordinarily sensitive instruments. They read the emotional atmosphere of a room the way adults read words on a page. And what Howard was reading from Bavier day after day was a form of emotional unavailability that stood in direct and jarring contrast to everything their scenes together were supposed to represent. On camera, she was his adoring Aunt Bee. Off camera, she was a woman who made it plain that the relationship ended the moment the director called cut. Howard has been careful over the years not to speak of Bavier with cruelty. He understands, from the distance of decades and the perspective of someone who has himself navigated the complicated intersection of talent and expectation, that her unhappiness was rooted in genuine pain. She had given her professional life to an art form she took seriously, only to find that her lasting legacy would be defined by a character she had never wanted to play. That is a particular kind of grief, and it is one that Howard has acknowledged with empathy. But empathy does not erase the lesson. What Bavier taught Howard, without ever intending to teach him anything, was that performance is often an act of willed creation rather than an expression of felt truth. Chemistry on screen does not require chemistry off it. A convincing display of love between actors can be built from craft alone, with no genuine affection underneath it. For a boy who was still learning what the industry actually was, this was a formative and somewhat disorienting revelation. It was his first introduction to the gap between the story and the reality, between the face the camera sees and the face that exists when the camera turns away. It also gave him something he would carry into his directing career, a profound respect for the difficulty of what actors are asked to do, and a corresponding commitment to creating sets where people did not have to suffer in order to perform. Howard's reputation as a director who builds genuinely collaborative, emotionally safe environments is not an accident. It is, at least in part, a deliberate response to what he experienced as a child standing next to a woman who was suffering visibly and managing it silently. If Francis Bavier's difficulty was quiet and internal, the difficulty of Yul Brynner was the opposite in every conceivable way. Where Bavier withdrew, Brynner expanded. Where Bavier's presence created a chill, Brynner's created a kind of atmospheric pressure, a sense that the air itself had been rearranged to accommodate someone of unusual magnitude. Ron Howard encountered Brynner in 1959 on the set of The Journey. Howard was 5 years old. Brynner was at the height of his powers, a figure so thoroughly associated with the role of a king, in The King and I in particular, that the line between the character and the man had become effectively invisible. He moved through the world as though he had never stopped playing royalty, as though the camera were always on and the throne were always present. For a 5-year-old, this was not inspiring. It was frightening. Howard has spoken about the experience of being in Brynner's presence as something genuinely different from ordinary intimidation. This was not the discomfort of meeting a stranger or the shyness that many children feel around adults they don't know. This was something more primal, the sense of being in the presence of a force that had no particular interest in your existence and would not have altered its behavior in any way if you had simply ceased to exist. The studio system that had produced Brynner treated its major stars as sovereign entities, and Brynner had absorbed that treatment so completely that it had become his entire identity. He was the center of gravity on any set he inhabited, not because he demanded it verbally, though he could, but because his entire physical and psychological bearing communicated that any other arrangement was simply not on offer. Howard watched adult professionals, seasoned crew members, experienced actors, people who had worked on major productions for years, alter their behavior in his presence. They spoke differently, moved differently, checked themselves in ways they didn't check themselves when Brynner was absent. The entire emotional ecosystem of the production organized itself around the needs, moods, and satisfaction of one man. And Howard, even at 5, understood on some instinctive level that this was a problem. The lesson Howard drew from Brynner was not about Brynner at all. It was about the kind of director and the kind of person he did not want to become. Howard's sets, throughout his entire career as a filmmaker, have been defined by a spirit of genuine egalitarianism. He introduces himself to every crew member on the first day of production. He treats the grip with the same fundamental respect he offers the star. He creates environments in which people feel seen rather than subordinated. That is not a default setting. That is a choice made consciously and maintained deliberately in direct response to having watched what the alternative looks like. Brynner showed him that a set built on fear and subordination can produce powerful work, but it cannot produce the kind of work that comes from people who are genuinely free. And it cannot produce the kind of human experience that Howard believed, even as a child, that filmmaking ought to be. By 1982, Ron Howard was no longer a child navigating the imposing personalities of Golden Age stars. He was a young director with something to prove, and Night Shift was his opportunity to prove it. The film required a particular kind of delicate tonal balance, comedy that was loose and energetic, but grounded in characters who felt genuinely human. In Michael Keaton, Howard found an improvisational live wire. In Henry Winkler, he found warmth and instinct. And in Shelley Long, he found something he had not entirely anticipated, a brilliant actress whose very commitment to excellence became one of the most significant challenges of his early directing career. Long was a product of Chicago's Second City tradition, a performance background that prizes intellectual rigor, character deconstruction, and the thorough interrogation of motivation. These are genuine virtues in the right context. They produce actors who are layered, specific, and impossible to dismiss as merely decorative. Long brought all of those qualities to her performance in Night Shift, and the film is better for them. The difficulty was one of tempo. Howard had grown up in the world of television production, where efficiency is not merely a preference, but a survival requirement. Time is money in any film production, but in the episodic television world where Howard had spent his formative professional years, the cost of delay was immediate and visible. He had developed an instinct for momentum, for the productive energy of a set that was moving forward. That was genuinely important to him. Long's process moved at a different speed. She wanted to understand not just what her character said, but why she would choose those words over any other words. She wanted to explore the psychological architecture of each scene before committing to it. She asked questions, a lot of questions, at a point in the production process when Howard needed answers and forward motion, not further inquiry. Industry observers who were present during the production and who have spoken about that period over the years have described Long during this era as someone whose perfectionism could shade into an unconscious obliviousness to the needs of the people around her. She was not, by any account that Howard has offered, malicious. She was not a diva in the theatrical sense. She was simply someone whose internal standard of readiness did not match the external requirements of the production schedule, and that mismatch created friction that was genuine and sustained. What Howard had to learn, and learn quickly, was the difference between an actor who is using process as a shield and an actor who genuinely cannot proceed without the answers they are seeking. Long was the latter. Her questions were not a power play. They were a form of professional self-protection, a way of ensuring that she would not be exposed as insufficient when the camera rolled. Understanding that distinction changed how Howard approached the problem. He learned to meet her where she was, to answer her questions with patience rather than frustration, and to trust that the time spent in that laboratory-like preparation would appear on screen as something valuable. It did. Long's performance in Night Shift has a quality of felt vulnerability that elevates the film and gives its comedy genuine emotional stakes. But the lesson was larger than that single production. Howard came away from Night Shift with a clearer understanding of what directing actually requires, that the camera and the lights are the easy parts, and that the real work is the ongoing, patient, sometimes exhausting process of understanding what each individual performer needs in order to give you what you need. He became a better director in the difficult months of that shoot. Long had given him that, even if the gift was wrapped in considerable frustration. When Ron Howard cast Russell Crowe in A Beautiful Mind in 2001, he was not under any illusions about what he was signing up for. Crowe's reputation at that point in his career was one of the most thoroughly documented in the industry, a performer of towering, Oscar-validated ability whose commitment to his craft was matched only by the intensity of his temperament. Working with Russell Crowe was understood in industry circles to be a serious undertaking. What Howard discovered during production of A Beautiful Mind, and later during Cinderella Man, was something more nuanced than the popular narrative of Crowe as simply difficult. The actor was not difficult in the way that a demanding diva is difficult. He was not particularly interested in special treatment or elevated comfort. What he was interested in, with an almost frightening single-mindedness, was the truth of the character he was playing. And his definition of truth was one that tolerated almost no compromise. Crowe arrived at the set of A Beautiful Mind having thoroughly inhabited John Nash, not just the intellectual brilliance, but the psychological unraveling, the paranoia, the devastating gap between a mind of extraordinary power and a social self that could barely function. He had done the work. And having done the work, he expected the production to honor it by providing him with the conditions he believed were necessary to bring it to the screen faithfully. One of those conditions was a preference for shooting the film in something closer to chronological order, a request that, from a purely logistical standpoint, was a production manager's nightmare.